All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We have a packed house in here today. Super excited about that. Um, my name is Nina Gomez Fernandini from the University of Miami. I'm a Higher Ed Advisory Council member, and I will be the moderator for this session. Very near and dear to my heart, as Tommy is one of my coworkers on the Salesforce team at UM. So, really excited for him to talk to you guys about code reviews and how you can take control of your Salesforce org. While Tommy's presenting, I'll be monitoring the chat and Q&A, which you can find at the right of your screen. So, Tommy, it's all you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my session, Code Reviews and You. My name is Tommy Chaisuesomboon. I'm currently the Senior Application Software Developer working for the University of Miami. I've been working within Salesforce development for about 3.5 to 4 years, and it's been a really great journey being, learning all these new skills and, hopefully being able to share some of what I've learned with you all as well. So with that, I'm going to go over our agenda. So first, I'll discuss keeping track of Salesforce development. Then I'll kind of cover our review, the code review template. Then I'll discuss on how you can make the template and the process yours. And then I'm going to end by discussing some final considerations for this code review template. So first of all, have you ever had the issue where you feel like you have too much code and not enough documentation? You can't find the information you're looking for some of your development work. Maybe you've had a legacy system that you've inherited, or you had some outside contractors that didn't document their work properly. You're not alone, because our team also had these pains and pain points for trying to find documentation for code, trying to find what this thing does or why this code was written this way. In order to understand what kind of contributes to this problem of, there not being enough documentation, we kind of have to understand what makes the Salesforce platform and Salesforce development kind of unique. First off, developer knowledge is often siloed from system admin knowledge. A lot of times developers are working in their own silos, and when they're looking at the developer console, the system admin doesn't necessarily see what that work is. So when we're discussing the Salesforce development ecosystem, it's both declarative and programmatic. So you have both point and click tools, and then you can also create Visual Force, Apex code, and programmatic solutions as well. And then next, since we use change sets for deployment, that also ties into the next point about there being no native source control, where it makes keeping track of code changes more difficult because change sets aren't the most descriptive, and it takes time to implement a source control system. Because of that, code documentation mainly exists in code comments, just due to standard practice. But because of the way that admins should know about developer work, that ends up creating a gap, a knowledge gap. And then finally, with Salesforce development, best practices are not necessarily official guidelines, and they can change. It's no surprise that you'll see code bases and work ending up like this. Admins kind of just see the solution, in the front, but then underneath it all, it's just massive wires and who knows how it's running. Other times, if you're not aware of your code base, you can end up being like this. You can have developers, kind of just seeing code, approving it, but not really knowing why it works. So what was our solution to really try to address this? We came up with a code review template. So what that means is we wanted to create a way for us to really enhance traditional code review. Since traditional code reviews are often performed in developer environments where they have things like source control or automated testing, a lot of times the code reviews don't need to be as descriptive. But because Salesforce has a lot of elements that are beyond just traditional programming, that it's important for admins to also have knowledge into what is being reviewed and what is being changed in the code. For developers, using a template allows us to standardize the review process, so reviews are performed the same way each time, and it also codifies the current best practices. This means that if we're looking back throughout time, we can see what best practices were in place at that point and why it was approved, because, as I said, best practices can change. It also clarifies where code documentation should live, because then it makes it so that developers don't need to maintain complicated headers for their documentation of their Apex classes. They can reference, this documentation and have that really be where they are tracking the specific descriptions. And finally, it sets expectations and helps them track development work. This allows, if you are using junior developers, it can teach them what the best practices or standards are. And it also kind of gives developers an understanding of what is being or what will be reviewed. This also helps for the knowledge transfer process if you're using resources such as external developers, consultants, just people not on your team, because by including them in this process, that really helps facilitate that knowledge transfer. For system admins, it builds the code-based documentation so that the code changes aren't necessarily as much of a black hole for them. They might not necessarily know exactly why something was coded this way, but they can know in general terms what the solution is, what objects are involved, how the sharing model is impacted. And that really helps bridge that knowledge gap with the developers. By having this code review template, as a document, it really grants that visibility into the review process. And also for system admins, the code review template can be used for not just code, even though it's in the name code review, but you can use it for declarative development as well. You can use it for assessing flows, making sure that best practices are being managed there, or for process builder, or for other declarative work. So just because it's primarily used for code review doesn't mean that there aren't solutions in Salesforce that should be reviewed and compared to a standard as well. So I'm going to kind of cover what a generalized code review process could look like, adapted essentially from ours. The first step for the review process is that the developer has to complete their development work and their code, their solution is ready for review. The second step is that the developer fills out the overview page and sends that to the reviewer. In a second, I'll show you what the overview page and the code review matrix page look like. So just hang on to your seats. Next, when the reviewer gets that code review template, they'll use that and then look over the code and then fill out the code review matrix based off of the standards that apply to the development work. Then the reviewer passes or fails the code review and summarizes the review for each component. Right here, they are really giving that thumbs up or thumbs down on how the code is built, how the code is implemented. As Nina mentioned earlier, if you want to learn more about solution design, you can go to her session, but this is past that solution design stage. This is just reviewing the code and the structure itself. Finally, once that code review is passed or failed, it gets filed into the appropriate folder for future reference. So you want to make sure that depending on how your work is organized, that it gets put in the right place so that you can actually use it and refer to it when needed. So first off, I'm going to kind of review the overview page. If we look at number 1, this is where we have information on the review itself. It kind of helps understand what work the code is associated with, who developed it, who reviewed it, really just kind of giving that general information that might be useful to give context on the review. The second part is kind of the general description of the work itself, how the solution was built. This is where the developer can kind of explain, what the development choices were, what objects they're referring to, but just to kind of give, a brief summary on what was actually built and why. 3 is where you can add a list of components. So you can actually kind of put in what kind of development component it is, whether it's an Apex class, a trigger, visual force. This is all controlled by using, pick lists in Excel. So you can just add to that pick list if there's additional things that you want to add in there. And then finally, the component description and the code reviewer summary are where the developer can put in general, like what they've changed on that class, on that development component itself, to really kind of divide out the work and explain that more specifically. and then the reviewer can give their specific review on that page. Maybe there might be a component that fails, but everything else looks good. This is kind of where you also want to think about how you want to handle failures. If a failure during code review means that the developer goes back and finishes the work until it passes, or if there's a component that fails. We can discuss that on when we talk about how to make this process yours. Next, this is the code review matrix. So this is kind of where we've actually listed out standards that we want to ensure that we capture with our development work. This helps ensure that our developers stay on the same page and that they're using just general best practices specifically for Salesforce, and also potentially for internal standards as well. In case you're using internal style guides, or if there are specific resources that you need to refer to, you can add those here. You can add in your status as well. So then this is where the reviewer can actually go in and fail or pass a specific status. Again, you can develop how you want a failure to operate, but this is where they can indicate what failed and why it failed. If you look at number 3, this is kind of where we put our reviewer notes and developer notes in case the developer wants to clarify something in terms of a standard, or if the reviewer notes something. It might not necessarily cause it to fail, but just something that you want additional information on for a specific standard. So finally, this is below the general standards. This is where you can add component standards. You can select if a component is not in scope, or you can also select, if it's new, if it's updated. And this is where you can get really specific on your standards. If you have specific process builders that you need to ensure are, still running in the right way, or if you have a flow naming convention that you want to use, you can add that here as well. This can kind of be customized to your needs, and we just created a general standard based off of general Salesforce best practices. Finally, now we can discuss about making the process yours. So really, when we're thinking about the code review template and the code review process, it's not just thinking about, code itself. We have to think about how many developers are on your team and who needs to see and participate in code review. As I said, because Salesforce is a unique development ecosystem, you may have people that are more skilled with declarative development, but might also need insight into code development. So you want to know where your resources are needed, and what you're able to actually do with reviewing. Then you kind of want to think about how your work and projects are managed and how are your files organized, because then you can think about how you want the code review template and that documentation to be related to that. And then finally, you want to think about what you actually want to get from that code review process. What do you want to actually document in a code review? What do you want to ensure is kept as a best practice? And then how should failures be handled? How do you want successes to be handled? It really can be adapted to what process works best for you and your team. You can add the code review process to an existing, model of work. For us, for example, we use an agile methodology. So for us, code review happens at the end of development, right before testing begins. If you use the waterfall method, you can add the code review after implementation and before you test, just to ensure that if there's any other development work that needs to be happening, that gets caught before it goes to QA. Finally, I do want to remind you that the review matrix is not an exhaustive list of best practices. They can change, and the sample review standards that I have here are just taken from Salesforce articles, community articles, and just general Salesforce best practices to kind of create that list. But it's not exhaustive, and it can be changed. Standards and processes change. Things that may have been a best practice back in 2016 may no longer be best practices now. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind, because what's considered best practice now might change going into the future. And if you do start using this process, you should think about making incremental improvements. Think about where the pain points are for your developers when it comes to documenting, or what your admins still need in order to really be informed about their code base and their org. One point that I do want to stress, though, is that we don't want to over-document. One thing that you want developers to do is you want them to keep developing. You don't want them to have to document so much that it ends up being, a significant burden. But we also want to ensure that, our Salesforce code base and our Salesforce orgs are documented enough that we can actually be informed going into the future. From here, what you should really aim to do is start maturing your developer processes. One thing that I want to mention is, adding things like source control can be a first step. If you don't want to go on to things like, continuous integration and things like that, just think about where your developer work process can start maturing from here, because this is just the start. And finally, I want you to take what works for you. If you just think that the list of standards is what you need and you don't really need the other documentation, that's fine. Or if you just really wanted to know what we were doing, that's great. This is not a prescriptive thing. I'm not telling you what to do. I want you all to kind of take what works for you. And if you have any feedback or any experience yourself, we would love to learn about what you've done and how you've adapted this or adopted some things from this. Thank you all for my presentation, and I think we have some time for Q&A.
Tommy, that was awesome. Thank you. Great job. There have been some questions coming in. I'm going to start at the top. Hopefully we'll get through them. Haley asked, what do we use for tracking changes? And I think this template is the answer right now, right?
Yeah, so this template, in addition to, since we use Agile and we use Agile Accelerator in Salesforce, we attach these code reviews to our work items. So that way we have, the work item in reference and then also the specific code change that was made there.
Awesome. And how often are we reviewing these for updates and changes?
Right now, it's been kind of like with the release updates. I've been taking a look at that with just has, different things come out, just to make sure that, there mightn't be new standards coming out or new things to keep in mind. Like flows, for example, had a pretty big update recently that we might want to start considering, how should we create a best practice for that?
Yeah, we've been talking about that a lot. Every time we read a new note for flow, it's like, we should go back to the code review template, right, Tommy?
Yeah.
Lisa asked, does your team have something similar for configuration changes completed by the sysadmin so that it won't conflict with development changes?
So right now we have pretty much a sister document for this that's more on the declarative and admin configuration side, which isn't fully fleshed out yet. It's a little difficult to ensure from just the template that a development change won't overwrite an admin change. But I think that could be something that you kind of establish in that process. Like if you're reviewing an admin change, maybe part of the review process is including that developer or developers just to ensure that this doesn't overwrite their work.
Awesome. Patrick asked if we have any tips for reviewing flows. Speaking of flows, we found the metadata can be hard to parse and the UI doesn't provide any change tracking.
Yeah. So we have had, with flows, we are still kind of in the process of utilizing them more. So we don't have as many, unfortunately, I don't have as much direct advice that I can give you on reviewing flows extensively. But I would definitely look into at least some of the release documents and also a lot of the Salesforce community experts. There's a lot of people that have been pretty good at explaining, what good flow builder practices are. And so those are really the resources that I've relied on in terms of building out my code review template.
Awesome. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. There was two similar questions from Patrick and Chad about if we've automated any part of this process.
So
and what tools are we using in our code reviews?
So we haven't fully automated this process out. And that's definitely one thing that is on our radar in terms of maturing our developer process, is starting to add in some of these automations. I know we have some static code analyses tools that I have installed, but I haven't incorporated that into the process yet. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. I forget what it's called. I don't know if it's like Salesforce Apex, like linter or something like that. But it was a static code analyzer that would kind of review your code. And you can definitely incorporate things like that into the template and your process as well. And if you wanted a copy of this code review template as well, you're free to email me. My email is txc760@miami.edu. And it's also on my baseball card.
Awesome. Thanks, Tommy.
Mhm.
Going to go 60 seconds more. Chad asked, how do we handle the assignment of code reviews?
So for our team, it's easy because we have a development team of 2. I review my other developer's code. He reviews my code. So yeah.
For us, it's a little bit easy. I think if you have a bigger team, maybe a round robin type thing, if you have a senior, your senior should be the one reviewing it and doing that type of work. And then Rebecca, last question asks, what do you recommend if documenting changes has not been a process the team was doing previously?
Then I think in that case, if having extensive documentation is a new practice that might not be applicable, I think in that case, you might want to think about, at that point, just jumping maybe to maturing that developer org and implementing things like version control to really kind of get that base for code documentation. Because if you're trying to create a documentation base, it's a little bit more difficult if you don't have that practice already. And so this is for our team, since we do have that practice, it was easier for us to adapt, but it might make more sense to just see what it would take for you to start actually creating more, version control or source control using those tools.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tommy, and thank you everyone for joining and for hanging out with us. Obviously, there's more content still to come. We've got a few hours left in this awesome conference. I'm going to shamelessly plug my session. It's next at 3:30. Come join us if you want to talk solution design. You can also go visit, of course, our sponsors in their booths, join a networking table to connect with other members of the community. And we'll see you in the next one.